photojournalist Amr Alfiky, organizer, journalist, and author asha bandele, journalist Holloway, and our moderator, artist, activist Shaun Leonardo. Shaun, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. I'm feeling rather charged this evening, particularly because the election is tomorrow, so as I've asked all the panelists, we're just gonna go right in. And Brian gives us a very particular starting point in considering what does it mean for marginalized communities to feel safe in an age of aggression, particularly when violence enacted on these same communities are so often excused when enacted by white citizens. And then as an extension of that, I would also like to place, what does it look like for marginalized communities to occupy the Second Amendment and to hold that as true to any of the panelists?
You know, as a white woman, I really think my main role here tonight is
the
mic. Oh. Yep. It's on. All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
As a white woman on the panel, I think my main role here tonight is to listen. You know, what does it take for marginalized communities to feel safe? I mean, I work with marginalized communities every day. We teach empowerment, self-defense. But without any sort of accountability, with such extreme criminalization of self-defense, if you're black, if you're trans, or if you're gender non-conforming, if you're a wife of a husband who has abused you, there's no recourse. I mean, what does it look like? What does it take? I mean, I think it's on white people. I think it's on people with a different level of power and positionality to really push for accountability. That's where we have to start.
So I wrote a piece earlier this year, I think right after the Parkland shooting, that was semi-satirical, and the headline was, are you hoping for gun control? Then support a movement to arm black folks en masse. And the premise was essentially that if black people really started arming themselves, if they started lots of gun clubs, if they started enrolling in the NRA, we would get gun control legislation very quickly. That has historically been true in this country. The very first gun law was passed in 1640 before this country was even the United States, in Virginia, and basically what it just said explicitly is that black people cannot own guns, whether they are free people or enslaved. The 1857 Dred Scott decision, within that decision, it was stated that citizenship could not be extended to black folks very specifically because they would then be allowed to own guns. And so then you have the black codes after the Civil War, which again, you had a lot of groups of white men who went around to ensure that black people did not have guns, and one of those groups became the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, we could talk about the Panthers, obviously. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. But so I think a lot about what it means in a country where there is a constitutional right that is only extended to certain members of that society, right? And that is, it's never explicitly stated, but it's something that has been very clearly conveyed. I just sort of thinking about that in terms of how communities are or are not allowed to protect themselves, who is allowed to protect themselves, what does it mean to protect themselves, who's allowed to stand their ground. All of these things come up in a period when I think that most of us feel, particularly if you are a person of color or you are othered, that there is a different level of violence in the air all the time.
Okay, so after the Parkland shooting, I decided to work with the population I usually work with, the Muslim American population, and to explore the gun culture and their existence within like the firearm community and whether they're represented or underrepresented, or the motivation behind the raise, the increase of like numbers of Muslim Americans who are owning guns in the Netherlands, with the increase of hate crimes that has like reached the maximum after Trump was elected. And that's like if I reported that. So I started talking with Muslim Americans who own guns, and I wanted to learn about like the reasons behind this gun ownership. Especially because they're Muslims or Muslim Americans, they kind of like passively exist within this debate, but never ever were like represented, like really represented, or had any kind of voice. Like for example, if the mass shooting was carried out by a Muslim man, it's a terrorist attack, and the Muslim community is blamed for that, like as a whole, right? Not only in the U.S., but maybe like all over the world. Like you are killing us. And the Parkland shooting was carried out by a white person, and the Parkland area, I knew like a few friends who are Muslims, gun owners, business owners, and they also like have kids who attend that school, right? So going through the research and trying to find Muslims to talk about their experience within the firearm community, some of them were NRA members, and they all agree that they are not represented in the NRA, and their voice is like doesn't mean anything, and the NRA used them as some kind of token. So like we have Muslims, we're diverse, we represent like America and a diverse society, but all of them agree that like they're not represented and they are used as tokens, and the majority of them were planning to leave the NRA because they feel like they do not exist in the NRA. So I came through like 2 lawsuits that were filed, one in 2015 and the other was in 2016 in Oklahoma and Florida. So in Oklahoma, Rajai Fatiha, he's an African American. He's from Philadelphia. He comes, his parents converted to Islam in the 1970s, and now he resides in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But going to a gun range in Oklahoma that declared itself as a Muslim-free zone, he wanted like to be the bridge between his community, who like has like different people who likes guns or like go to the range or like take pride in being Americans or like being like Southern Americans, and like that's a part of the culture for the most part. But he was denied access to the range. Then he filed a lawsuit, right? And they denied him access because of his faith, right? The other lawsuit was in Florida, and you can find the videos on YouTube. The gun store owner, his name is Andy, and he posted a video with a Confederate flag behind him, declaring his facility as a Muslim-free zone. And then Florida filed a lawsuit against Andy and his store. And that's usually what Muslim Americans face when they go to the range or to go to the gun store, right? So there's just like the experience of a part of this population that wants to either defend themselves or take pride of being Americans or like practicing their Second Amendment rights. The other part was, which was the majority of the characters I interviewed, like they were afraid, right? They wanted to defend themselves. They wanted to defend their families. Some of them were Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, African Americans, white Americans, Native Americans. Like they come from like different minority groups and different communities, but they all agreed on one thing: they're being killed, and they want to protect themselves and their families, right? So, yeah, I mean, like, how can you make them feel safe without like arming themselves? And for example, one of the women that I interviewed, when she was going out of getting off work, and she was approached by a white man who then like offended her, and he started like saying racial slurs and threatened her, and then she's dealing with PTSD, right? And she had like, she hates guns, she's pro-gun reform, gun control, but that was the only way to defend herself, to arm herself.
Thank you for that. Oh, this is not on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Janet and everybody at New York Live Arts and Brian for pulling this together, and all of you for coming out in this drizzly, yucky rain, which made my shoes harder to walk in, and for letting me go last so I could hear your brilliance. So I wonder if it makes sense to pull apart the question of safety from the question of guns. I think even if we talked about, black people already have arms. So I'm gonna pull out the South Side Chicago girl in me. So we have guns. That's not a problem, right? It's whether or not we know what to do with them when we actually have them. So I think about, because you raised the Panthers, we should talk about Fred Hampton, who originated the Rainbow Coalition. And he takes the Black Pea Stone Rangers and he makes them the mighty Black Stone Nation. And those guns they had once used to kill one another, they used to defend themselves and used to stand for their community. And that was a shift in what hasn't been said, which is white supremacy, right? So even if we had guns, would we know what to do with them if we had them? And so I like to think about safety in other ways. Guns, you know, because it is so horrible to think about the things that have happened in synagogues, in churches, on street corners, in Kroger supermarkets. It's beyond the pale. Ayanna Stanley Jones, 7 years old, sleeping in her bed. But what actually kills us and what actually makes us not safe are the stressors that are born of white supremacy that we deal with every day and our unmanaged reactions to it, right? So we know that more people that'll kill you faster than any gun. We know that the stressors born of white supremacy and racism are more predictive of you getting cancer and dying than smoking Newports. We know that. So when I think about stress, I think about and dying and safety, I think about how we manage some of that. What does it mean that black men and black women have the lowest life expectancies in America? What does it mean that that's directly related to elevated cortisol levels that make us so sick that we die early, that we black women, our wombs drive the maternal morbidity rate in this country. We're dead and our babies die, and it doesn't matter whether you're poor or wealthy, whether you have access to prenatal care and a good doctor or not, at every level. And so when I think about safety, I think about it much differently. It's how I've raised my daughter, to think about safety in a very holistic way, and one that doesn't include weapons, although we know that you do what you need to do if somebody's coming at you. You have that right as a human being. You have a right to defend the sovereignty of your body. Full stop. We know that. That said, if that's what we talk about, we miss all of these other factors that are actually killing us every single day in far greater numbers. There's no reason anybody should die of HIV infection when there's PrEP, but we are. Black men who sleep with men are dying at rates of AIDS as though it was 1985, as though Reagan was still president, God help us. How is that possible? How is it possible that we are dying of all these things? And so while we have to talk about what we need to do to protect ourselves, I want that conversation to be expansive. The purpose of the Second Amendment was the right to protect oneself against really an occupying, England coming in, right? The UK coming in. But they're not coming in anymore. They're here. They're here. And they're coming at you and coming at us in myriad ways. It's often not just the police or some white supremacist running up in a synagogue or a church, but coming up maybe in the elevator with you and grabbing their bag a little closer maybe refusing to ever promote you, or making you think $15 is the livable wage we should be fighting for when you know you can't raise your children on that. So for me, safety is a much bigger piece. It's what I have to think about every day as a mother. Safety is a holistic thing about how we eat, who comes at us, who we allow in our space, who becomes part of our sacred circle, and how we react to them when people who don't have our best interests in mind come at us.
So alongside these very real stressors is this idea of fear, which Amr, you now center. And yet, given that the title of this panel is the right to bear arms, I want to ask, and also I should say, given that with this fear that, let's be honest, every community carries, that fear is internalized, the way it's directed shifts from individual to individual. However, in terms of owning and bearing arms, the idea of that fear being equated with self-defense is articulated very differently when it's a white person holding a firearm. How do you tackle that, let's say, way in which fear is permitted from one community to another?
And also who's allowed to be a victim.
I mean, do we agree that every community has the same fear? I don't know that I agree with that.
I think they have very different fears.
I think it is. I mean, I remember a therapist telling me, a black woman I had, telling me about a woman in a survivors group that she was in, who a man had attacked her, and sexually. And so she ran, she fought, she bit his tongue, and fought, and she ran. So it was a white woman. And I guess they were by the water, and she ran into the ocean to protect herself, right, from this guy coming at her. And then she heard voices on the beach, and she, started screaming, help, 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 and they did. They came, and they helped her. And my therapist started crying. And I said, why were you crying? And she said, because it would never have occurred to me to say help. I didn't think anybody would come for me. So I don't know that. I know that it took me a long time to understand the fear my boyfriend had, who was dark-skinned, with, growing up in a privileged, middle-class, black environment, a light-skinned woman, parents were university deans. There was a limitation, there were certain privileges that I had growing up and didn't understand my boyfriend's fear until I was walking down the street with him and I saw the police riding behind us. And I was like, oh, that's what you mean. Because that had never happened to me. So I don't know. I just think that maybe we pull that apart a little bit, Shaun. Because not everybody has fear, although the second part is true. The questions around how do we handle it.
But I think everyone has fear. The question of how justified that fear is, right? Because right now there is an entire country that is feeding off. I mean, there is a president who is telegraphing a message that is be afraid, be very afraid, be very afraid, and there's this consumption of that fear. I don't think that fear-mongering, I think, has always been a part of American politics, but in a way that I've never seen during my lifetime. So that fear is present all over, and it's obviously a very scary time. But in my personal opinion, whether or not those fears are justified and who you're being told to fear, and whether or not that's true or not is different for all of us.
And I'll push back on him and shut up. I'll say this, when I had arguments with a lot of my contemporaries about whether or not to vote in the last election, and Hillary and whoever were the same, I said, you say that because you got some papers. I've sat in those courts. My husband was deported. So it's not, you know what I mean? Like, people can say they're afraid, just like some people can say they're good looking and they're not. It's just not true. Blake Shelton or whatever is not the sexiest man on the planet. It's just not true. You can say it, but I know you just look better every day. And that's just fact. So I'm just saying, you can say it, but it's not actually tethered to reality. What you have is insanity. That's what you have.
Sure, I'm not arguing that. I mean, I'm saying the difference in these fears is one is justified, one is based in reality, and there is another one that I think is just a fuel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wanna echo the idea of the fuel. I was talking to someone who got a gun permit from South Carolina and took a class. And what you're taught is to shoot to kill. It's legal self-defense. And this was a class of white people. And the whole idea with stand your ground is protect your castle, protect your property. And I was kind of horrified as I listened to this, because in empowerment self-defense, what we teach is get away, stay safe, protect yourself. Like we do teach some self-defense moves based in martial arts where you can really seriously send someone to the hospital if you need to. But the idea is to get away, look around, see who you might go to ask for help. And and it's interesting that you give that example, because the first time I took one of the self-defense classes at my organization, I was surprised that we spent so much time yelling, stop, don't touch me, help. And we do these milling exercises where you actually look around the room, you look for exits, you train yourself to think, okay, I can go to that person, I can go to her, and you actually practice and role play. And for me, that wasn't revolutionary. And it was revolutionary for so many of the kids that we were working with, from Black and brown and Muslim and immigrant communities. So, but my big point was about, it's just this point. If you're white and you shoot to kill, you can claim self-defense in a way that communities of color and immigrant communities absolutely can. And I was looking at some of the data, and it's staggering. And I would invite every white person in this room to go look up some of that research. I mean, maybe you're familiar with it, but I knew it in theory. But when you really see the numbers, so you mentioned how Black people have guns in Chicago, but also if you're trying to get a gun legally, I think it's like 800 to 1 in terms of where people of color are turned down to get legal guns versus white people. So back to fear. I agree, Callie. What is the rational fear? What are these ideological threats that people in power, that white people have? What are we so terrified of?
And Amir, before you jump in, I just wanted to pile something onto what you just said, in that in the environments of gun ranges, and particularly in the military and within police forces, when you own a gun, again, the way which self-defense is projected onto a uniquely American violence. Guns are meant to be used. And so this idea of how we connect self-defense with safety is a misnomer in the context of America, because, as you've just said, so often the teaching and preaching is, once you raise that gun, it's meant to be shot. And it's meant to be used to kill. And this is being promoted within all sectors of American society. So the idea in which we utilize or frame it as self-defense, and then it is projected onto this very unique American violence, we have to start to consider the ways in which, in so many of these cases, an officer's fear is enough to get them off. And so and we use that as a filter, and we have to understand that they never used an option of shooting elsewhere. Because that fear is justifiable. And therefore, self-defense is equated with shooting to kill.
So I want to touch on 2 points. The first point was fear within minorities. I think fear in minority groups or among people of color is justified all the time. For example, my wife, Hadia, she's Muslim American. She was born and raised in New Jersey. I came to the US 4 years ago. So she's hijabi, and she grew up in the United States after 9/11, right? So after 9/11, FBI agents would go to their Islamic schools and ask them, how did your parents react when the attack happened?
Wow. Wow.
What kind of TV channels did you watch? And the Islamic school couldn't resist, because like if you're not letting FBI agents into a school, you're definitely hiding something, right? So that's one incident that happened to her, and then like she would tell me like a lot of stories from like her mother. She wears a burqa, so when they went to the supermarket, someone attacked her mother and spat in her face. She was always watched. She went to Rutgers in New Jersey, like she was always watched, like wearing a headscarf. She's visibly Muslim, like she can be identified easily. So she grew up here as a minority. I grew up in Egypt as a majority. So in the beginning, I never understood what that feels, what does that fear look like, right? Like we were like on the subway, and after the Chelsea attack happened, and she was like trying to look at the people, like who's watching me, and for me, like I didn't give a shit, like I don't care, like I'm not afraid, right? So that's why I started working with the Muslim population, especially Muslim American millennials who grew up after 9/11. I'm trying to understand like this fear and what are their techniques of resilience and resistance, and like changing how they're being seen and received, right? So one thing I tried to do before I did the gun story, Muslim gun owners, for the New York Times, I was giving a talk at George Mason University in Virginia, and I pulled up a picture of white man holding an AK-47, one picture, and the second picture was a Muslim man with a beard and a kufi and holding the same gun. I was like, who's a terrorist? And the students were like, they didn't answer, but it was so clear that they were leaning towards the Muslim man to be the terrorist. And that, after the Parkland shooting, I was trying to look for a Muslim who looked the same to put him on the New York Times, so people would see like Muslims who own guns, not all of them are terrorists. And that's how, if they are spreading fear among minorities, I want them to confront their fears and to examine like how their fears are true and justified, right? So the comments and the feedback that came out after the story, some of them were like, oh, I didn't know that. That was like enlightening. I never knew that was a saying, like Muslims with guns in the United States. I only hear about that when like there's an attack or a mass shooting or something like that. I didn't know that maybe some of them go to the range. I go to the range every week, and I didn't know that they even existed. I was like, okay, so now you're more aware. Like if you know there's a Muslim or a man of color on the shooting line with you in the range, you need to be like supportive, like try to create some safe space for them to be with you at the range. And the other part was like, this is bullshit, and you're all terrorists, and if you're trying to like justify why you own guns, why do you own guns, right? And one white man, I was giving a talk, and he asked me, like, why would you do that story? And when I tried to explain that, it didn't make any sense to me. Like, he didn't even understand the fear and what this community is going through, because they're like passively related to any kind of terrorist attack, mass shooting automatically. And like after what happened, the terrible massacre that happened at the Tree of Life synagogue so a friend of mine was like, this is like, I'm so sorry for what happened, but I'm happy the shooter wasn't Muslim, because I would go like, yeah.
So it brings up a few questions, and I actually want to relate it back to the intent of the Second Amendment that you clarified, which I think is really important. I'll try to bring this all together. It sounds like to me, Amr, that part of the framing or reframing that needs to happen is that violence is enacted by everyone, and that terrorism is not particular to one identity. And if we could start framing white violence as terrorism, then maybe things would shift. But also maybe we need to start reframing who's a gun owner for that to be better understood, whether the intent is self-defense or otherwise. And so On top of that, I want to bring up your point in that the Second Amendment is actually written the right to keep and bear arms, meaning that it was originally written with the mindset to defend oneself, to defend the populace from an oppressive government.
Right.
If we hold that as true and dear, as many people still do, because I've been privy to have this conversation in other parts of the country with both liberals and conservatives, and there are members of both that will say that that as an amendment, as a protection against one own's government, is righteous and justifiable. Does that become a valid reason for communities of color to then arm up, given that its intent is protection against one's own government?
I mean, yes, and I think we would understand it in another context, right? I mean, I think that there's nobody here who would take issue with Mkhonto we Sizwe, all right? They introduced themselves to South Africa with like 19 simultaneous bombings. That's how the world comes to know who Nelson Mandela is. And nobody here would ever challenge that, right? So I think that, do you have a right to protect yourself from an oppressive government as somebody who's black? But just do the checklist. We're the only people in the United States who've ever been declared non-human, right? We're the only people who've been enslaved consistently, and our children were. We're killed in rates by police and other arms of the government far higher than anyone else. Even Native Americans, which always shocks me given what was done to First Nation people. I mean, so do we have a right to defend? I think everybody has the right to, and I think we especially do, and it's actually backed up by fact. There's actually historical and current data to say that you have the right to protect yourself. Yeah, so I mean, I think that that's sort of undeniable, but I appreciate you clarifying ever more deeply the point. The point is to protect yourself against an oppressive government. And white people know that too. Ruby Ridge. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, they do that too. Idaho. You ever been to Idaho? Me neither. But I'm just saying. but you know, I'm like, people, they know that. And so it's understanding that, so that if you have the architecture of what you need to protect yourself, embedded in that is a political philosophy, and also the idea of what you're going to build. Because we don't get to that point quite enough, the world we want to see. You know, we don't actually know, many times, can't articulate, and I do this with organizers all the time, what winning looks like. What is that other side of the mountain? What's a world without guns? Can you imagine that? You think about a world where we don't, kill each other for $5, whatever our $5 is, right, whether it's 50 million or whatever. Can we even imagine that?
Anyone else? How are we doing on time, though?
That's a good question. Maybe one more question in a group, and then we'll open it up for Q&A.
Great, that's what I need to know. So I'm glad you point out this envisioning process. Because I always, on any panel, attempt to lead with, if not actionable steps, at least a vision. And one of the important questions that Brian and I started to ask ourselves as we led to this was trying to find a way to articulate how we've gotten here, in the massive use of violence in an American context, that again, this fear pervades all communities. Ideas of, or justification of self-defense pervades all communities. The way it's projected onto violence, or the need for violence, I would say is uniquely American. How did we get here, and what's the path toward a different world that we want to live in?
I mean, I worry that I'm not answering the question because when I'm still sort of thinking about, like, do communities of color have a right to protect themselves? And I think, and I'm sorry to back up, but the answer seems so obvious to me that it's yes, but I constantly think about the fact that there are lots of us who are not allowed to be victims. I was just looking back at this survey that, like, UCLA did, this study, I think it's from 2014. They found where there were like 200 some odd people involved in this study, and about half of them were police, and the vast majority of the police were white. And they found that black boys, and there was another study they did that found the same for girls, were seen as innocent up until the age of 9.
Right.
And then afterwards were seen as not innocent, but also older, on an average by about 4.5 years. So Tamir Rice doesn't get to be a victim, right? It's how Michael Brown can have superhuman strength. It's, and then I also just read a study today that I didn't realize this, that apparently more than any other group, and I'm sure that if we could dig into the numbers, and there's a smaller sample, but unarmed black women are killed more than any other group. I did not know that. In terms of unarmed black women are more likely to be victims of police violence, are killed more than any other group. And I'm sure you could break down the numbers, and the numbers are probably different, but
By statistics.
yeah. And yet, there's just this inability to see some of us as victims. So I feel like that's so interwoven with this conversation about self-protection, because if it is impossible for your life to be threatened or for you to be in danger because you are always the threat, I just don't know where to go with that. It's part of why I think thinking about this conversation for me was really hard, because I kept getting trapped in that. And that is the thing that I think is it's just so a part of the way that America sees, particularly black folks. I'll expand that to people of color, but particularly black folks. That it makes self-protection really difficult. And not even just self-protection, but just even just being seen as human and vulnerable.
I think when you're always reminded, or you're always seen like a threat, and then like when you come to practice like your rights, for example, like the Second Amendment right, you start like asking yourself, because at some point you start to believe that you're a threat, right? So, for example, like one of the subjects I interviewed for that story, and I think like everyone here like who hasn't looked at the story or read the story, I think it's enlightening, not because I did it, because they have like a lot of good experiences to share. So what Nizar Hamza, he's Lebanese American, and he's a deputy sheriff of Broward County, and he was one of the responders to the Parkland shooting. And what he does gun safety trainings in mosques all over the country, and so far he did like 130 mosques all over the country. And when I asked him about like why some Muslims are owning guns recently, but the community is opposing them to arm themselves. And what he said is because Muslims or minorities, for the most part, they have like this victim mentality. Like if they go and own guns, they are afraid they're some sort of list, because they're always seen as a threat. That's how they see themselves in media. That's how they see themselves in TV, all over the place. That's how they see themselves. So like they have like this victim mentality, and instead of being like in the public eye they are the threat, but internally they are victims. So that like doesn't leave them like the freedom to like be like active rights or practice the rights like a white person, for example. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So, just thinking about, Shaun, the question of the world we want to live in, I guess that I often have asked people to think about the home they live in, or their ideal home, right? And so not all of us have grown up in perfect and ideal homes. But I've tried to create one for my daughter and I. And my daughter is basically perfect, and also was the only black student in her school to ED into Columbia University and Ivy League. So they were big missing. I get that in there every time. No, what I'm saying is, like, when I created that home, that was not supposed to be a peaceful home. Her father, she was conceived on a trailer in a prison. I came home with her by myself. I never had anyone with me. My parents are older, so they couldn't be there. She was late, because that's what Aries do. So I didn't even have my girlfriend there anymore, because she had to get back to work. So it was very intentional in terms of creating this very peaceful home. So the bills were always paid. If you acted like an idiot, some guy that I was dating, you had to go, nobody stayed. We have a very loving relationship. The lights are on, the food is cooked. I mean, it's just all of that. So when I think about the world we want to live in, I'm sure that people want some extension of those things, right? You're not worried about money, right? You have enough. Maybe you're not traveling the world and doing everything, but you got what you need. No one's cold, no one's hungry, no one's any of that, right? Everything that Martin Luther King sort of laid out in the idea of a beloved community. And it's really not that hard to imagine if you can also imagine giving things up. And that's the piece where we often get stuck. And when my daughter was in high school, it's almost hard to think of. It's amazing to think about how far we've come in a short period of time. I remember having an argument with a certain number of parents about gender neutral bathrooms. And there were a lot of people who didn't want gender neutral bathrooms. They had all kinds of reasons. I was sitting there tripping. I was like, this is really a debate, yo? Like, really? Like, I'm worried about damn tuition. But finally I said, it's just like the bathrooms in your goddamn house. They go in, and they go in, and they go in, and they go in. I said, can we just have that? And they were like, oh, yeah, right, okay. So, when I think about the world that we want to live in, I think about the most horrible moment in that Pittsburgh community. And I think about that man going in and shooting up 97-year-old people, brothers who did nothing but welcome whole communities in. And that man not only shot up those innocent people, but he shot at the police. And you know what happened? They took him alive. I want to live in that world.
Open up. Loren, did you have anything you wanted to as a closing?
I don't think I can add anything after that. I guess the fundamental thing that I hear when you say everything that you said is, I want to live in a world where we're human and where our humanity is the thing, the lens that we use more than all these other lenses that block things. Just fundamental, basic human rights to have your family, to walk down the street without being harassed or scared of getting beaten up, without getting killed, and just knowing that your life matters, that life matters. It doesn't matter what color you are, or religion you are, or gender you are. I think something about just life over material possessions, life over competition, life over consumption. I think that's the world I'm looking for.
I think that also change will come when the conversation or discussion about safety becomes inclusive and includes the voices of minorities and when they are heard and when their fears and their challenges are heard and respected. I think that will lead to a change. Not to dismiss their experiences and to dismiss their feelings and their daily struggles, right? Because I believe, like you said, not all the communities have the same kinds of fears. So I don't think a white person might understand like what a black person goes through like in their daily lives, or a non-Muslim person would understand like a Muslim or a Jewish person would go through like their daily lives. But when these voices are heard, I think that when we can like start like change.
Thank you, everyone. We'll open it up to a few questions in the audience.
Yeah, let's give a round of applause for
Correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but a microphone will be passed out in the event that someone wants to ask a question.
Indeed.
Okay.
Any questions? Anyone? And please tell room your name.
Hi, my name is Michael Loeb. Thank you so much for the panel, Brian. So first, starting like, what do I want my home to be like? I've slept in 2 homes where there were guns. So in one case, the gun is under my bed. In another case, it was locked up. I don't want to be in either of those homes. So if it's the big picture, no guns, right?
Yeah.
But then the conversation I usually have about gun control or like abolish civil ownership of guns is people kill themselves with guns, people accidentally shoot children with guns, people's guns are stolen and then used in crimes, people's guns, they kill their partner or they kill somebody that they're mad at. So guns don't make us safer. But then my black friends say, look, the police are gonna kill me. There's somebody with a rifle is gonna kill me. Like, and I say, I will come for your gun last. Like, but I'm not sure I have a question. I'm just saying, like, there is a first question of like, do we want guns at all? Do we? That their only purpose is to kill. It's not to scare.
What's the actual practical path toward the removal of that?
And then after last week, you know, my daughter's not going to get killed like that. So.
Michael, isn't it, you know, I think that some of it is really about challenging all of us to have a different idea of what safety is. And many of the people who nurtured me as a college student and a little before, you know, growing up, were Black Panthers. And so I certainly grew up with the idea and belief in and have supported and defended and still do people who picked up guns to defend their community. That's never gone away and it never will. And I believe that we have a right to defend ourselves. But I think that we get stuck in a conversation about safety that's very still in an American frame. You know what I mean? So it's like, so safety only becomes about fighting. Or, you know what I mean, this direct sort of hand-to-hand combat. If we began to think about what makes us safe in a larger context, what actually makes us feel good, okay to walk in the street, I think that guns would matter less and less and less and less. And that's a harder conversation to have, right? But if you went where, you know, to your point, you know, Callie, about fear, you're right. I was thinking about it after you said it, about people having fear. But if somebody had a real conversation about what are you really afraid of, it's probably the light bill. It's probably, do I have enough food to stretch to get through the week? You know, it may be fear of being alone. You know what I mean? Like one of the main organizers who I knew said that she didn't want to die fat, black, bitter, alone, unloved, and unrecognized. That was her great fear. I know people like that. And so I think it's like how we begin to redefine these terms and have some of the conversations about what fear really is, because you're right, everybody does have fear. But what is that fear tethered to, and what is safety, and what actually makes us safe?
And the stuff that, I mean, I was glad that you talked about sort of safety in a larger context, because after the 2016 election, I got really obsessed with thinking about trauma. And I think that we are such a traumatized society. I mean, just constantly. I mean, it's particularly, I think it's much more acute for religious and ethnic and racial minorities. But I feel like so much of people's trauma, if people would stop and realize that their anger is about something that is very hurt inside, that is a very young part, I mean, therapists talk about this all the time. You know what I mean? I mean, I interviewed a bunch of therapists, and I did a few articles on this after the election, who were just talking about the line of people who showed up at their offices crying the next day, with real palpable fear. And the people who are always calling other people snowflakes are the people with, I think, the softest parts. And that's not a conversation that we really have, and we exist in this constant state of trauma. I mean, the whole ability to sort of get over your trauma is that it becomes a closed event in the past, but we're just swimming in it. I wish that was a conversation that we had more often.
I want to say a word about anti-violence work. So I run an anti-violence organization, and what that means is we're not non-violent, it's different. We're against violence. So what is everything you have to do to stop violence, to prevent, to interrupt, to heal from? So we talk about like the 3 S's: self-defense, social justice, and self-care. And so, because there's such intense trauma, there is so much trauma. I mean, our traditions are traumatic. This country was built on traumatic events. So what do we need to do to practice self-care? And it looks different for different people, certainly. But to start valuing that. And it's interesting because it's such small steps in a lot of ways. But I mean, didn't Audre Lorde say that self-care is a revolutionary act? So I do think safety is about so much. How are we creating communities of belonging? How are we creating spaces where we can be brave and we can have conversations? And I had a conversation with a group of, we have a group called Pride Protectors, and they're trans and gender nonconforming young people who've been homeless. And they're like, we don't want this to be a queer organization. We don't need a rainbow flag. What we like about it is that it's so mixed here, and we can be us here. So that's one of the ways, like when I think about anti-violence, it's so many things to be safe.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Julie. Can you hear me? First of all, it's a huge topic, so my hat goes off to the panel for trying to address it in this way. And I just want to say that I think about fear, safety, self-defense like this endless feedback loop. And so it's easier for me to think about it in smaller ways. And I want to go right to what you were saying, Asha, about the home. And the reason why I say that is because I do a lot of work with women who are currently incarcerated because they defended themselves against someone who was abusing them and or trying to kill them. And they have no right to self-defense. And those are predominantly Black women, women of color, trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary, sex workers and immigrant women. And who are the most vulnerable both to state violence and to interpersonal violence. And it goes back to that concept of no self to defend, because society doesn't see you as having a self that is supposed to be defended. And I think about the case of Larissa Alexander in Florida, who I'm sure you know of. That defense wasn't available to her because the court deemed that she wasn't frightened enough, or she wasn't in fear of her life. And for that to change is a sea change. But I think that's the underpinning to a lot of it. Who gets to defend themselves? Whose life is valuable enough to be seen in the way that society is set up now? So if I had to think about what I would want to see, it would be a world in which, well, definitely there was no carceral state and there was no police, but beyond that, but we'd still have violence, even if that was gone. So how would we address that with community accountability processes in which harm is acknowledged, and then how do we unpack the harm, and how do people who have caused harm be held accountable, knowing that they have most likely been harmed as well? So I wish I could have formulated that into a question, but, so my apologies, because I hate when people do this. But so for me, but it was sort of like that was what all of your brilliance sort of was stirring up in me. That's part. I think that's a part of the conversation. So if anybody wanted to comment on that, that would be great.
I mean, yeah, you have a question?
I do.
If I would like to just contribute one thing, although it was not a question, but to sort of tie your two comments together. I think it's important, I often think to myself how important it is to first actually validate people's fears. Because that is true and very real to these citizens. But then I immediately ask, because I'm with you, like in my perfect sense, in my perfect world, we would eradicate gun violence and guns entirely. But but the immediate step, I think, is building in accountability into legislation, into the various systems that have a hold on this violence. Which is in direct contradiction to validating fears, because fears lead to this violence. But I do believe there's a way to more productively use fear. And I'll share a very quick anecdote to express this. I was with a young man today that I worked with through a diversion program, and I was alerted to the fact that he was going to be in a fight. And he did fight. And I asked him, what the repercussions were, and he couldn't really articulate what they might be. And so what I said to him was that, I'm not going to tell you they shouldn't have fought. As a matter of fact, I probably would have fought too. But what I did say to him is, could you imagine thinking about fighting this kid without going to jail, without retaliation that might end your life or your friend's life? And when I put it that way, I could sense that the fear was moving somewhere else, and it went from having to defend this person and himself against this act, and more toward the fear of losing everything that he had going for him. And I think if we can start to reframe how we hold fear, we might start to hold our own communities more accountable. And I think that's actually where we start. Rather than demystifying or challenging another community's fear, we have to start utilizing our own fear more productively to keep each other safe, and direct that energy somewhere else.
My name is Julius. Thank you for your testimony. It was powerful. It seems to me that when it comes to questions of fear and safety, the communities that are the safest have the least justified fear, and the communities that are the least safe have the most justified fear. And the folks who arguably need to hear your testimony the most are not in this room. They're at the president's rallies, they're wearing MAGA hats. I guess the question then becomes, how do we reach those folks? Because I'm not saying that they don't have real fear, but I think their fear is being outsourced to other things. Like the asylum seekers reaching the border. It's easy to outsource fear, right? To convince them that their problems are outside and not inside. So how do we reach them? How do we have this conversation with them? Because I'm looking at the preachers, I'm sitting in the choir. And I hope that we can broaden the scope of who we're reaching beyond us.
Let me just start, because that speaks to something we were talking about as a group earlier. And I think that however much I might think I'm part of the choir or preaching to the choir, there's so much more that I need to be doing as a white person, as someone who's got a real level of safety, although I'm Jewish and the Pittsburgh massacre really kind of threw me, but just in terms of pushing for accountability, we talked about protests, so we go to protests or we write letters or maybe we'll even speak to some of our elected officials. But we can't stop until it's done. So I think how we broaden the circle is by being way more relentless. Just pushing till we see some kind of real change. And I think that example is what's going to bring other people around. I mean, we teach something called upstander, which is active bystander intervention. When you're on the train and you see someone getting harassed, or you see that, you know, someone pulling their purse closer away from someone, do something. Go align yourself with someone being intimidated. So I hear you, and I think that too. But I also think there is so much more we can be doing.
I agree with Loren. I mean, I think that rooms like this, and which is also the rooms that I'm in, or like in Brooklyn, are for us to like deepen our thought about things. I didn't know the piece about 1640, right? When we were first, I was like, what? And it was like, taking it. So I always learn something in these rooms, and it helps me to deepen my thinking, how we say things. And I was talking about Muslim millennials, right? Well, when actually, I'm ashamed that I didn't know the particular tenets of your organization, because I actually love the organization and have supported it. You know what I mean? So there were just, there's always things that I've learned. And I think we take that learning, and that's the responsibility of this room. Whatever our role is in the world outside of this room, how we bullhorn it, is about our creativity. I write books. I write articles like Callie, and I'm a journalist. And so, we got Jay-Z on the front page of the New York Times, and the video that went viral was their top op-doc. He had never come out for a political, with a political organization before, although we knew he supported it quietly. And he came out to legalize marijuana so nobody under the age of 18 would ever have to go to jail again for marijuana in California. We won that shit. You know what I'm saying? But it was like those constant conversations that deepened my thinking about both marijuana, drug laws, the drug war, and then it just happened that we all were from Brooklyn. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't like anything special. You know what I mean? Just so we all knew each other, we were able to parlay that. And I'm just, so it's like, but it's that thinking didn't begin out there. It began in rooms like this. And so you take what you learn and you figure out how do you have a footprint in some of these other places to reach people. I don't try to tailor in to an audience that doesn't necessarily want to be reached or is screaming, you can grab my pussy, Trump. You know what I'm saying? That's not like, I'm not like, hey homie, what's up? But I think that if we keep speaking truth, I believe in truth, speaking truth to power. I believe it changes people. I believe Black Lives Matter changed people. And women saying that, 3 Black women, right, saying that changed a society. And so I just wanted to separate out what the role of this room is. And your question made me think better about that. Right? Like, why are we here? And then what do we do next?
Go ahead.
Oh, I just want to, so I think that art has a really important role. I think that like writing and things like that, I think they open up a space, a social space that allows change to come. I think art does stuff that you can't do otherwise because people's eyes glaze over. But I also, being super duper frank, I think writing is fighting, so I write and I do other creative projects and I work with activists and historians. But I heard this phrase the other day that I thought was so amazing, and I forget who to attribute this to, but the quote was, do not waste your time arguing with someone who is committed to not understanding you. And that really hit me because it really summed up a thought that I've had over the last 2 years, which is, it is not of value to me personally to build bridges with people who deny my humanity, right? There's no meeting point, there's no middle ground for us to meet on. So while I think that those bridges need to be built, and I look at Van Jones who's out there doing it, God bless you, go do it. but I am not invested in doing that work. I think it needs to be done. I just think the personal cost that it takes from me, I don't think that's good for me in terms of the fight that I'm trying to wage.
The only thing I was going to add before is that I think it's so critical to be in community and build relationships. And this is a marathon, right? Like, it's not a sprint. And so what do we need to do? Who do you need to be with? How do you start to keep building coalitions and community and you know, stay in it? And I think that's one of the additional purposes of this room.
You know something else, Julia, is that this is like the story that inspires me, like, more than anything. And I don't know if it'll inspire you, but maybe. So in the early 1960s, when people were first getting together to think about how to ensure voting rights, it's hard, you know, I can't even imagine if this would be done and, like, funded by anybody, because the metrics were so bad, you know. So a man went down to Mississippi before the buses, before all of that, named Bob Moses, a great mathematician and even greater organizer. And I think it was in 1962, maybe 63, but it was right in there, and he went to register people to vote. And of course, there was so much violence, people were afraid, but he did have some success. Do you know? And so that first year they went down, do you know how many people he registered? It was one person, one! You know, if people had gone back to one of the foundations now, the nonprofit industrial complex, they'd be like, we're pulling out funding, yo! Of course, the next year, the Freedom Riders came and we celebrate them. You know, that's their greatest generation, right? So we celebrated, but somewhere there was a conversation in a room very similar to this, where they were like, we're just going in. We're gonna go in and try. I don't know. And somebody was like, I'm not with it, right? And Bob Moses went. And Ella Baker elevated that and inspired a generation of young people who went the next year and who kept going down, right? From all over the country, from all faiths. So I just say that to say that it has to begin somewhere. You know, and these conversations help us. I don't know who's going to find a different kind of courage because they were here. You know, maybe it's me. I don't know. But somebody will. Because Bob Moses was here. And that memory lives in us. That example lives in all of us. It's here. Can't take it away.
I think that might be the note.